sure you've noticed those signs at the entrance of many businesses that say no firearms allowed and by some certain statute. Of course, as private businesses, these businesses are held to have the right to restrict firearms on their own property. However, as private citizens, should they really have the right to restrict me and us from carrying a firearm? The United States Constitution grants us the right to keep and bear arms. In my opinion, these two situations conflict with each other, and as such, I believe that I cannot have that right restricted from me due to it being a constitutional right. I say this is with the possibility of one restriction. If a private business wants to restrict my ability to bear arms on their property, then I believe they must be assuming the role of policing all people that come onto their property, as well as assuming liability for the protection of all people entering their property. This means if I can't carry arms on their private property, then this owner must ensure with very strict measures that no one can carry arms on their property. This does not mean that they simply put up a sign saying they are prohibited. This means they would actually be responsible for the use of metal detectors and have security personnel to do searches that ensures no one carries firearms on their property. Of course, they're not going to usually do that due to the expense, so they take the lazy way out and put up a ridiculous sign. To me, honest enforcement actions to assure no one is armed would satisfy me enough that I would feel at least a little more comfortable in not being allowed to bear arms. However, due to the expense and difficulty enforcing, I do not see this happening anywhere for the most part, except for governmental agencies or large public gatherings. Even though on the surface this makes me feel a little more comfortable in these places, when they do real active security checks, it does not entirely make me feel comfortable because I realize this large gathering would then be a possible target for a terrorist attack. It's a soft target. Of course, I will always feel more comfortable with the ability to protect myself with my own firearm, a firearm that I have a constitutional right to possess. This being said, I do have extensive firearms training and a law enforcement background. Not everyone will necessarily feel this way. I beg to ask the question though, why am I, as a law-abiding, trained former law enforcement officer, restricted from carrying a firearm anywhere? Why is this particular constitutional right singled out for restriction when others are not? If someone's going to break the law and attempt to do harm, why would you restrict law-abiding citizens from protecting themselves? How does restricting law-abiding citizens from carrying a firearm affect the ability or desire of irrational or criminal people from committing terrible acts? It's obvious that people wishing to commit acts of terrorism most always look for a soft target, a place that guns are prohibited, to carry out their actions. That is why these acts always seem to take place at schools, churches, movie theaters, where firearms are strictly prohibited, or shopping malls that prohibit firearms. Have you ever noticed mass shooters seem to avoid police stations or NRA gatherings? They seem to get it that the later places are not soft targets, and they are more likely to get return fire. One may want to bring up that we have had mass shootings at military bases and think that goes against what I'm saying. But even the military bases that were attacked were soft targets in that weapons were not allowed except in very specific training situations on the gun range. Getting away from private individuals restricting my carrying of firearms on their private property, I'd like to take a look at governmental restrictions on that carry. Any governmental restrictions on the carry of firearms should always have a very sound and thought out reason for that policy, and these restrictions should be very few. When those restrictions exist, I'm more comfortable with restrictions when security personnel are actively searching and looking for firearms and have measures in place to detect firearms than I am when they merely put up a sign saying firearms are not allowed. I've never seen a sign that can effectively enforce any law. All the enforcement by signage does is to ensure that law abiding citizens are unarmed, making them a soft target for those that are not law abiding. I've studied a number of situations where active shooters went into buildings and did mass shootings. I find it interesting that even though they were carrying a firearm into a public building, these shooters usually went out of their way to ensure that they chose a target that was a soft target. In other words, law abiding citizens would be unarmed due to signage that says firearms are not allowed. Of course, non law abiding citizens would ignore the sign and have some security in the fact that they would be facing unarmed people. What are the chances that two active shooters would randomly show up at the same time anyway? This is why I don't think anyone should be expected to obey a sign restricting firearms unless active measures are taken to make sure that everyone is restricted from having a firearm in that venue. That being said, I believe a case can be made for liability on the part of individuals and organizations that put up unenforced signage banning firearms. With such signage, with no active enforcement of the ban, if they were then the victims of a shooting incident where everyone obeyed the signs except the shooter, then it would cause abiding people to be the victims when they otherwise may have been able to protect themselves from an active shooter at that venue. I think it is time to put people on alert. They will be held accountable for signage banning firearms but not enforcing that policy in order to protect those that comply with the signage. Let's talk about the intent and the violence aspect of gun control. We have nothing to fear from people who have no evil intent. We unfortunately do have to protect ourselves from those that have an evil intent. Why would a reasonable and prudent person try to lump together those that have evil intent with those that do not and act as if the gun is actually the underlying problem? In fact, guns are not the problem. Guns are a tool to use for a purpose, and they were protected in the Constitution in order that that useful aspect of this tool could be accessed to protect our very constitutional government from being corrupted and to protect ourselves when the government is not able to do so. Take a look at incidents around the world where guns were not allowed to be owned by the public or an individual does not have access to guns. Knives, swords, machetes, motor vehicles, poison, bombs, and airplanes, to name a few things off the top of my head, have been used to attack innocent people. None of those things are granted to us in a constitutional right, yet there are no cries to ban those tools used in violence. I hate the term gun violence. Violence can be committed without a gun, but a gun is not going to harm anyone without the intentional act of someone causing that gun to do harm. In other words, without a gun, a violent person is still violent and dangerous. Without violent intent, a gun is just another tool or object to be used. There truly is no such thing as gun violence. There is only violence, and a mentally disturbed person or a violent person will use whatever means they can to affect their violence on others. We have a mental health issue, not a gun issue. Stable and healthy individuals do not kill innocent people with anything. Everything about violence that is used to affect the violence is variable except the underlying violence itself. The issue of so-called gun violence will only be resolved when the mental health and criminal issues that cause the violence are resolved. Laws about guns are not going to solve mental health issues, and criminals don't, by definition, obey laws. We need to learn basic logic in this country and practice critical thinking to honestly tackle this problem, or the problem of violence will just continue. We conveniently turn a blind eye to mental health in this country, and that is one of the weaknesses in our very foundation that we must address instead of going down rabbit holes blaming inanimate objects for our violence problem. You can just not legislate mental health nor compliance from criminals to laws. Only healthy, law abiding citizens are being punished when you try to legislate this problem by keying on the gun as the problem. People who are not mentally healthy can be treated and prevented from access to dangerous tools such as guns, and criminals must be dealt with by vigorous law enforcement and, as a very last resort, with our Second Amendment right to defend ourselves. Thank you.